Thanks for joining us for our weekly program of discussion. It's called Moral Side of the News, and we're glad you're here this weekend. I'm John Blim with the WHAS Crusade for Children. With me, as always, is a distinguished panel. Dr. Marian Taylor, South Frankfort Presbyterian Church. Rabbi Emeritus Stan Miles, Temple Shalom. Father Bill Hammer, St. Margaret Mary and St. William's Catholic Churches. And Reverend Clay Calloway, West Louisville Ministers Coalition. We begin our discussion with headline-making news from Minneapolis this week. Former police officer Derek Chavin was found guilty on all 3 counts in the murder last May of George Floyd. Racial justice advocates hope this verdict sparks greater systemic change as the Department of Justice launches an inquiry into Minneapolis police operations. So now to our panel, let's get your reaction to the verdict. Where does this lead us, and how does this compare to what we've seen unfold here in Louisville in the wake of the death of Breonna Taylor?
Well, this was the verdict seen and heard around the world. It was the earth-shaking, world-shaking episode that captured the imagination of the world. Literally, 2020. It was COVID, and then it was the George Floyd, I guess, public lynching, murder, horror story that really grabbed the headlines last year, and rightly so. So the verdict, of course, was just as earth-shaking. It's telling for so many ways. It was a clear reckoning in so many ways. It was almost Shakespearean in its scope and in its poetry, in my opinion. The parallels and the implications connected to the trial, of course, and the verdict as well. America was clearly on trial there for a lot of reasons. The fact that I've talked to some colleagues of mine that had occurred around Easter weekend as well, that parallel was not lost either. So it appeared to be a lot of parallels there with a lot of meaning. Of course, getting back to your point, the verdict, of course, was clearly a resounding verdict that was heard around the world, literally. They were celebrating and affirming it in countries around the world. Paris, in particular, referenced it as well. And then there's a lot more to do. There's more investigation coming, announced from the Department of Justice, investigating the systemic injustices within the police department there in Minneapolis is going on, as well as the remaining officers that are going on trial later this year. So I think the verdict is just a start. The real shock was that many people were shocked that it occurred. As President Biden mentioned, this was extremely rare. And that's the sad part about it. It was extremely rare to have an officer convicted under these circumstances, despite the overwhelming evidence, despite everything thrown against it except the kitchen sink, including the kitchen sink. It took all of that weight, all of that evidence to bring about this conviction. So I think it was good that it occurred the way it did, and especially giving a great commendation to the young girl, the 17-year-old, who dared to have the presence of mind and the courage to capture that whole episode on video, uninterrupted, unedited video, that without that video, no verdict. So I think it was so commendable in more ways than one, and I'm glad that it occurred the way it is. They clearly had implications here in Louisville, quite different, but some similarities. At least the officers there faced criminal charges here in Louisville that did not occur, and yet to occur. So it's quite different situations, but some similarities in terms of capturing the national attention and focus.
I also felt that the trial itself was an event in that many of the people who testified against former Officer Chauvin were his colleagues, were his superiors. There wasn't any sort of wall, a police wall against him being convicted. And hopefully that will demonstrate some changes in the way that policing happens. Of course, at the same time, this week, we had the filming of the man in Louisville being punched repeatedly by the policeman. And there's a saying, it sounds better in French than it does in English. I don't speak French. The more things change, the more things stay the same. I found that to, even though, thank God, the man didn't die, I found that footage to be incredibly horrific. And today, the world we live in, when in doubt, consider the fact that you're probably filmed by somebody for something. And that's not necessarily a good thing or a bad thing, but it is a reality.
One of the things that I was not able to do, and probably very, very, very few people were able to do, is to watch the whole trial. Regrettably, I say from my point of view, I only caught, for the most part, the sound bites as it was carried in the media or on national news. But what I found from what I was watching and what was being picked up and put out was the main, seemed to me, line of defense was that this is perfectly acceptable policing procedure. That was the defense's line. There's nothing that prohibits this line and that a police officer, making arrest has almost total discretion to do whatever is necessary to subdue and to arrest this person. And I think if that has been repudiated, that alone in itself is some progress is going to come out of this trial. The sense that, you can basically do whatever you have to do or can do. And that's where I think it was interesting to see so many other officers, even in the Minneapolis area, saying, no, this was crossing the line. And then again, the whole line of argument, this is the defense's argument, that he didn't necessarily die from lack of air. It was all pre-existing conditions. And again, those kind of defense arguments that were so weak. This is being now silly on my part, but I'm wondering what the defense attorney might have been able to do if he would have videotaped himself on the ground, prone like that, with somebody on his neck for 9.5 minutes. And if he was still breathing okay. I mean, the fact is it was preposterous, part of the defense. And from my point of view, and the fact that it was then repudiated as a line of defense, hopefully that will stimulate other people to realize there are limits to what you can do to other human beings, even if they are suspected of a crime. Again, the person wasn't necessarily guilty, but just suspected of a crime. This is what you can or can't do. So these kind of discussions, I think, are also going to be very productive in the long haul, the long run.
Thank you, and I'm glad that there's still momentum for more work on police accountability. There have been some measures already just in the last 24 hours that indicate that the federal government wants to push for greater accountability in police work. That's where this needs to go. Part of what made this sort of the raw last nerve for America, especially for the millions who are African American, is that so many African Americans know somebody who's been the victim of excessive use of force or some kind of harassment. And so this became an emblematic case and a chance to tell that story for so many families who've had to have the talk with their kids that white families haven't had to have. So it brought a lot of that to light, and I think that was part of the symbolic value of the verdict, to say, you know, at least in one case, you know, we see this. I do think that there was another part of this story, though, for all Americans, whether they've had that life experience or not, which is, I think, just a basic human moral sense that if somebody has been subdued and is incapacitated and is in distress, we have a moral obligation to that person to help them. And so I think part of the horror for everyone, whether we were, you know, completely apprised of this other part of our history or not, is just at the human level, to see someone who's pinned down and needs help to not be given that help. So I think there was also that dimension to this, that it was traumatizing for the whole country to see someone coldly holding someone down who obviously needed help like that. You know, there are Good Samaritan laws that are designed to protect you if you intervene to help somebody in distress. Maybe the Good Samaritan laws need to be refurbished a little bit to say, you know, if you've got somebody who can't harm you and he's in distress, you should positively exercise a moral responsibility to that person.
Marian, you mentioned the word trauma. There's a lot of dimensions here. I mean, we will be discussing this for many, many weeks and years, I'm sure, to come. But some things that were unique here. It was one thing that's unique that probably would be a factor in his sentencing, is that it was a 9-year-old child that witnessed this. So it's the trauma that was inflicted upon this child by witnessing this horror. And many have drawn parallels between this episode and lynching, that it was a public lynching. I've heard some even say that this was not a matter of whether Derek Chavin was on trial, but rather whether public lynching was still legal or not. And one thing that was so unique about and common about public lynchings was that it was a public affair. And I had a book called Without Sanctuary. It's a book of photographs regarding over 100 years of lynching, another book called 100 Years of Lynching by Ralph Ginsberg. One thing that was so common about those incidents was that it was very public, and it was highly publicized, and there was almost always children there to witness the trauma of that horror. So you had that connected with this episode that made it so much like so many other lynching episodes in American history, that brought all that into the fore. And in some respects, Derek Chavin was kind of a victim of sorts, because he has done this sort of thing before. He has had over 20 complaints filed against him. He had even 3 episodes where he's actually been noted for choking someone, one a Black woman he did within the last 2 or 3 years or so. And instead of being reprimanded, he was rewarded for his conduct by being elevated to the level of being a trainer of other officers, which is what he was doing there. He was not the first man on the scene. The young officers were there first. He later came and later took charge of the scene because he was a senior officer there. And he took over and was, I guess, instructing them on how to, quote, handle the situation. So it was telling in that sense, and that the young child was there. It's a throwback to the lynching, I guess, many years of lynching that's occurred in this country, and that children were almost always involved, which made this so horrible. The media, I think people make a mistake, and I'm gonna let you get off of this. Look at this like it's a Black story. It's not a Black story. This is an American story. America was on trial. American legal system was on trial. American policing system was exposed. And the fact that it took place in Minneapolis, I've learned that that term polis is the same word from which we get police, from which we get policy, from which we get a politician. So many times police are just at the tail end of decisions made by politicians and subsequent policies. So it just kind of exposes all of that. That's why going forward, many are looking at, including the Department of Justice, looking at the whole policy system, the structure there, to see what can be done to change something that's been obviously going on for many years.
Marian, there was something that you alluded to earlier, and I read about it in reference to this case, and it is a discussion now about policing becoming a national movement, that there wouldn't be a Louisville police force or a Minneapolis police force or a Lexington police force, but there would be some sort of national police force with national standards countrywide. And I just don't know whether that is an answer at all. I sort of fear the concept of a national police force and where it could take us as a nation.
I actually have not heard of that idea. What I was commenting on was that the Department of Justice has the ability, when they see a pattern, when they think they see a pattern in a particular police force in a particular location, to conduct an investigation. And they've done that, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, in Baltimore. They've done it in a number of cities prior to this. I think that's a healthy thing.
I think so too. I agree.
You got to have different layers of government in order for that very reason, so that a higher layer can come in periodically when needed to conduct an investigation, find the facts, and set the public record straight.
But that is actually taking place here in Louisville. The federal case investigation is still ongoing with the Breonna Taylor. And talking with the Commonwealth Attorney Tom Wine, he says that don't discount that fact. That case is still proceeding and is still under investigation by the FBI. So there's a great value in having an outside and a higher authority to serve as a check and balance to intercede in cases like this.
And again, the prosecutor brought in experts from across the country, because there is a certain sense in which there are standards, general standards of conduct. And we need to learn from other mistakes. I would hope locally and lots of other cities and states would learn from this kind of mistake that was made in training and or in attitude. And we say there are certain things that are beyond the scope. But definitely, I too would react. My gut instinct would be very much against a national police. We have national security to protect the nation as a whole, but not to protect, individual local people. That's where people are best served by, again, their peers, and both in helping, and as well as in protecting.
Marian brought up a topic, a moral decision. Do you think in the future, if this were to happen again, someone would charge the police officer and physically take him off of a person like George Floyd, now that we've seen that video?
Well, that's the purpose of the George Floyd policing bill that's being considered now, is to make it easier for officers to intervene and less inclined to sit back and be observers, as it occurred with Derek Chavin. So they would have some incentives and some protections to protect them if they do decide to intercede and be a good Samaritan, or just a good policeman for that matter. So I think that's encouraging that that's being considered now.
I think there's it's complicated when you talk about, somebody say throwing themselves at that officer to knock him off. If that officer was alone, it's a different thing than if you got other officers around. But I would certainly, if I'm standing there, I would hope, I don't know, I've never been there in that moment. I would hope I start yelling, let him breathe, let him breathe. I can hear him, he's, let him, give him a breath, help, something, start and try to coax the other officers who are present to also take note of what's going on here. But, you run a risk, I think, in trying to discern between that and being actually an accomplice to something like that. So how that plays itself out, it would be very difficult to judge on a case-by-case basis. That would be so I would be concerned about if you start attacking officers, even if the officers themselves are acting wrong. But to challenge an officer would seem to me to be very, very much appropriate in any situation.
And there's an analogy to how church denominations and traditions function. We have some standards as all Presbyterians, and then if a local congregation runs afoul somehow of those standards, there are various layers, presbyteries, synods, general assembly levels above us, capable of coming in and setting things right. So I just think that there's something very healthy about that. It's built into the American structure, and I think it's a healthy thing to apply to police forces as well.
All right, I'd like to move on to our second topic. You're watching and listening to Moral Side of the News. In the wake of online learning during the pandemic, Jefferson County Public Schools is offering a first. Students can now request an extra year in school to make up for a year spent in virtual learning. A new state law allows all public school students to ask for a do-over year to retake or supplement classes interrupted by the coronavirus and school closures. High school students would also get a fifth year of athletic eligibility. So let's turn to our panel on Moral Side of the News. Panel, we have about 6 minutes left. Your thoughts on this do-over school year idea?
Well, I just want to jump in quickly to say that it would have to be done in a way that doesn't stigmatize either the children or their families for needing that extra year. And the surest way to do that is to say everyone's got an extra year. And then maybe you can test out of that extra year somehow. That would be my one concern about it. I also hope, now I'm not a professional educator, but I'm hopeful that people are underestimating the resilience of children, that they have been learning all along, that there's more to this than just content. But there's a lot about reasoning and observing and processing that is part of education. So I'm hopeful that we are jumping the gun a little bit and assuming that everybody needs all this remedial help.
I'm also hoping that it's not the child's decision. I mean, I can't see a 7-year-old saying, oh, I'd like to repeat first grade again. I think it needs to be a parental decision in conversation with the child, but definitely not the child's decision whether or not to go one way or the other.
I like the idea of a blanket option, like Marian mentioned. I think if it's a blanket option, it removes the stigma. I would love to have a do-over in life. I mean, a lot of things I've done, I wish I could just do over. So just the idea of a do-over has a certain appeal to me in so many other ways. And this year has been quite disruptive. I think the biggest disruption is in the social skills that was interrupted. I think, the reading, writing, and arithmetic, of course, can be acquired virtually, but it's the social skills that I think was the most disruptive through this pandemic. And those skills are just as important as every other learned skill in school. So I think it has merit to consider a do-over. And I'm glad that an option is on the table, personally. So I would appreciate that being an option that a parent can take advantage of.
Certainly seems to merit consideration. I think the fact is there's still a lot of details that the local site is supposed to try to sort out, like Jefferson County. I know that one of the big things that was mentioned over and over again early on, back in the fall, there's no need for children to be in person because, they can do it all online. They can learn it all online. I think what we're admitting now is there are things that you really do best learn in person, and that there are things that may not have been learned just simply because of being online. And those may be, again, equity issues, a lack of access to internet, lack of access to materials, lack of access to simply not only computers, but just time of day and things like that when they're home and parents unable to provide the assistance they need. But there has been also a tremendous pushback on even testing children. And because they basically don't want to figure out how far behind they are, national tests and things like that. But I do think a lot of the school systems that were able to go back early on to in person, and that's in the public school system too, a lot of that out in the state counties that went back much earlier will find that their children have caught up and are doing better. So it will need to be, I think, a local on-site decision, and ultimately always a parental one. But how to accommodate that, and particularly, again, size of the classrooms. If we're still going to start in August with social distancing in the classroom, then we're still going to have huge numbers that are going to still have to stay home. And so it keeps spiraling that cycle. It's complex, and I think it's a worthy discussion, but wait to see how it's implemented.
All right, finally, we have about a minute and a half left, panel. It's Derby week in Louisville. People are gathering, 45,000 at Churchill Downs. Are you concerned about the spread of the COVID-19 virus during Derby week, Derby 147? Your thoughts?
Of
Well,
course.
anytime, COVID is a social disease. So the more you get together, the more the exposure increases.
And of course, with people coming in from around the world with all those different variants, I'm holding my breath and praying that we won't be a super spreader.
That's a good point. And I think it's an event that attracts exactly the age group that has the least vaccinations already administered. Maybe just this one year, they should reserve the stands for only people over 65.
I mean, certainly in our
vaccinated, have vaccinated.
I was going to say in our denominations, attendance is certainly increasing right now. It's because people feel comfortable with the vaccinations. So there could be hopefully some self-limiting. If you haven't had the vaccine, then hopefully you would know, not to put yourself in that situation. But we're definitely having much greater increases in attendance in the last 3-4 weeks here at church. And it's because people are coming back, Father, I've now had my vaccines. I'm now safe. I'm comfortable. I'm ready to come back and interact. And so,
Father Bill Hammer, you have the last word on our program, Moral Side of the News. Thank you to our panel, Dr. Marian Taylor, Rabbi Emeritus Stan Miles, Father Bill Hammer, and Reverend Clay Calloway. Have a happy Derby. Be safe and stay well. Thank you, panel.